Thank you, Nina. So for our comment today, we have Julius Ruff, who is professor of history at Marquette University. He also, like one of his fellow panelists, received his PhD from the University of North Carolina. And like Jacob Mellish, had a stint at a French university, in his case, the Université Michel de Montaigne, Bordeaux 3. He's the author, as many of you will know, of numerous books, articles, book chapters, including, aptly for this panel, Violence in Early Modern Europe, 1500 to 1800, published with Cambridge University Press, recently translated into Turkish. And also, we have recently a reissue of his 1984 book, Crime, Justice, and Public Order in Old Regime France, the Sénéchaussée of Libourne and Bazas, 1696 to 1789, which has been republished by Routledge as part of their History of Crime and Punishment series.
Our panelists this afternoon have offered us 4 very interesting papers that provide valuable insight into female agency and the lives of old regime women. 3 of today's papers are based on research in criminal court records, and I will turn to them first since that's my stock in trade. I hope you and our panelists will excuse me for violating the specific order in which the papers were presented, but the 3 papers based on court records kind of make a good group. Old regime criminal court records certainly are rewarding sources for the study of gender, but they are just as certainly difficult sources to work with for this purpose. The fundamental problem is that women do not appear in very great numbers in such records, even in those of tribunals of first instance. Then, as now, physical violence was largely a male enterprise, and my own research experience largely confirms the observation of Peter Sperenberg of Erasmus University in Rotterdam, to whom Professor Mellish refers in his paper. Sperenberg concluded that women constituted, in his words, a tiny minority of those prosecuted for interpersonal violence. How tiny? In my reading a number of years ago of some 1,300 late 17th and 18th century criminal cases from Toussaint Chaussee in the rural Bordelais, these were, as many of you know, royal courts of first instance, and in the region I studied, there were, by the 18th century, no seigneurial courts, nothing lower in the hierarchy. I found in those records women named as defendants in about 15% of prosecutions for interpersonal violence. And when the actors in these cases were closely scrutinized to identify the primary defendants in such trials, the number of women fell to about 5% of the prosecutions. The women are there, but the historian has to really dig through the records to find them. And once that search has been accomplished, the historian will be richly rewarded for his or her labors only if that researcher subjects the trial records to a close and sensitive reading. Now, what do I mean by a close and sensitive reading? Women's importance is not just written in terms of the relatively small numbers of those put on trial. As Jacob shows, there was a filtration process at work in the old regime court system which tended to leave women out on many occasions. But there is a rich story to be told, even if women don't make it through the whole filtering process into the case. There are, with criminal cases in the old regime, voluminous witness testimonies that accompany the old regime criminal procedures, and these witness testimonies frequently reveal the voice and agency of many women at the scenes of criminal violence. There are far more women in the pages of these cases than simply the list of the women actually prosecuted. Thus we find women, non-offenders, commenting on violence at the scene of the crime, attempting at times to attenuate violence. Women have all sorts of roles to play, and those roles come out only when the researcher plows through perhaps a dossier, 3/4 of an inch thick, to read all of the witness testimony. If we do so, we find all sorts of things besides indicated women comment on violence, attenuate violence. We find too that communities could be quite tolerant of miscreants in their midst before those persons came to official notice in a criminal procedure. I'm struck every time I get into these kinds of records that inevitably they reveal that when the final prosecution is made, when you read the testimony, there have been repeated confrontations, repeated difficulties between the accused and the victim in the years preceding the actual crime. They've been fighting it out over land issues or other disputes for years, and the case had never come to court. And then finally, one day, one of them hits the other guy the wrong way, he kills him, and then the procureur du roi comes into the picture and the case is prosecuted. You find these litanies of past offenses that give you a much richer picture of what's going on. And certainly all of our criminal court case papers today do that. These records are very rich, and today's papers, I think, by Professors Mellish, Lachlan, Sofer, and Kushner, all reflect such deep and sensitive research into old regime court records. All three also suggest the extreme and sometimes lethal levels of violence of which we are coming to recognize old regime women were capable. Professor Mellish's paper draws on court records, as he has in the past, to open for us several perspectives on early modern Parisian women. He has already shown us in his 2010 article in French Historical Studies the results of close reading of Parisian criminal court records. Thus, Professor Mellish has been able to demonstrate the frequent intervention of female bystanders to attenuate, to limit the extent of male violence. His reading of 17th century Parisian court records in today's paper permits him to characterize the forms assumed by women's violence and to dispel the common characterization of that violence as minimal and mostly passive. He also dispels the misconception that violence was the work of the poor and disadvantaged. I hope for much more from these records and the research of Professor Mellish. Professor Lachlan Sofer's paper takes us from Paris to the very different world of the village. In doing so, she reminds us that villagers could accept much about people, even women once condemned for murder, provided, in the present case anyway, that these people were stakeholders in the village economic structure who could fit back into local village society. Thus, both Maurice Nail and Karine Deschamps killed other women and secured royal pardons for their acts. Nail, whose family was locally very prominent and landholders, however, seemed to fit seamlessly back into village life, at least if we take her subsequent absence from local court records as indication of peaceful coexistence with her neighbors. The quarrelsome Karine Deschamps, however, figures prominently in court records for years after her original offense due to recurring run-ins with her neighbors, in part, I believe Professor Lachlan Sofer correctly suggests, because villagers had little to lose as a result of conflicts with a woman of little means. Deschamps strikes me as the character one often finds in small-town criminal cases, and that character is the person who totally exhausts the patience of his or her neighbors by repeated offenses, so that finally the neighbors are willing to take the not small risk of going to criminal court and opening themselves up to possibly significant expenses to try to terminate this problem. The person who ends up in court generally is the proverbial square peg trying to be shoved into a round hole, and I think Karine Deschamps is precisely that sort of person. Finally, Professor Kushner gives us a very sensitive reading of the charges lodged by Antoine Baumet against his wife with his local Parisian police commissioner. The interest in this case lies in the nature of those charges, for they reveal that in 1787, contemporary ideas about female violence, masculinity, and sexual mores were in considerable flux. Madame Baumet was in an adulterous relationship with a family friend. She was stealing her husband's household goods to benefit her lover, and she flew into frequent rages when her husband attempted to terminate her affair. Yet her husband, a philosophe, chiefly complained of her extreme violence toward him and her thefts, and not the affair. Professor Kushner shows how this was entirely in line with the standards of an Enlightenment gentleman, educated to abhor violence and accept a certain amount of sexual liberty. Although we might also suggest that perhaps Baume already knew what we as historians are rediscovering, and that is that Charivari lampooning abused husbands unable to control their households had largely ceased earlier in Paris. In short, Baume had no cause to fear the informal social disciplining to which neighborhood young men of an earlier time might have subjected him as a man not in control of his own household. In any case, Commissioner Sirabal proved to possess a more traditional value system when he charged Madame Baume with adultery. The fourth and final of today's papers, that of Professor Osman, draws our attention to the violence of early modern warfare and the case of Capitaine Ansui, or Capitaine Capone, the castrated captain, a beautiful woman who dressed like a male cavalry officer to command men in battle and to fight duels defending her quote-unquote masculine honor when she was mocked by soldiers. This young woman had engaged in gender role reversal, an act that Natalie Z. Davis, Mary Wiesner Hanks, and other scholars of women's history remind us was seen in the early modern period as essentially subversive of all social order and stability. Yet the courage and manly behavior of this young woman, who fell at the head of her German cavalry at the siege of Turin in 1639, evoked the deepest respect in her French and Piedmontese opponents. Even so, however, the author Baudier, who recounts this event, was in some ways ever a man of his time. We note he's also searching for female attributes in the action of his dead foe. Now I'd like to turn to the audience for its questions and comments. We had an unusually large panel today. We are fitting 4 papers into a 105-minute time span that normally accommodates 2 or sometimes 2 or 3 papers. And I'd like to turn to the audience for your comments on these, I think, very rich and very, very interesting papers. Thank you.
We do have quite a bit of time left for discussion. I don't know if there's anything initially that the presenters would like to say in response to the comment, or should we go straight to audience questions, as we say?
I know in most of the cases, our presenters had to attenuate their presentations a bit. So I thought
okay, great.
I would yield the floor.
No, it's really good. We have a good half hour. So any initial thoughts burning to get off your chest, panelists?
I wish I'd spoken more slowly. I didn't know you had
Well, now's your chance to give us the missing paragraph. Anyone?
Can I add something? Okay, so this is something that I did cut for time, and also when I kind of took a different direction for the paper. And this is something I'm presenting to the audience as well, looking for any suggestions, ideas, thoughts, questions. The other interesting thing about this particular case is that I found another memoir written by a different person from the same siege, who also found a woman soldier among the dead. And I'm having a hard time telling if it's the same woman and this is just another person who was a standing by and witnessing this, or if this is a different woman entirely, because it's one of those cases where there's enough in common but enough different it could go either way. Different name for the woman soldier, and I do not remember her name because I didn't bring that note with me. Different name for the woman soldier, but she dressed as a man. They thought she was a eunuch. She was a German cavalry officer, but this woman had also married another woman, so as to complete her disguise, because she was so dedicated to being a soldier, she married another woman who was the most understanding woman in the world, to give up her married life to this other person in order to, again, kind of keep up this illusion. So that's also just neat. Yeah.
It was possible it wasn't an illusion. I mean.
Oh yes. Yeah, I thought about that too. Yes,
yeah.
Possible that it wasn't an illusion at all. That she was married to a woman because she wanted to be married to a woman. But that's how it had been
framed.
Discussed.
Yeah.
Discussed by the author of the memoir. Yeah.
Okay. There seem to be no other panelists who. Okay, so let's open it up to questions. And I've always wanted to do this. I get to bring the mic around and provide it to you. So please, let's have lots of questions so I can be Oprah.
Yeah, it's like Oprah.
Awesome.
Okay. Thanks. I have a question for Nina. I was wondering whether Baume gestures if he assigns any blame to his wife's lover, because I just find it so unusual that often in cases in elopement or runaways, when daughters run away, the fathers assign blame to the seducer 100% to deflect the domestic disobedience to something outside the household. So I was wondering if that is something that just totally doesn't occur in this case and why you don't think it happens. And the second thing I was wondering is how much of Beaumé's foregrounding of violence over adultery, do you think that was strategic on his behalf? What do you think he was seeking to apply pressure on his wife, but not necessarily have it result in her confinement to a convent in some ways? And so using the complaint as, without any intention of going further with it, but as a sort of threat to her that he could if he so chose. So in that way, I guess I'm asking, is the foregrounding violence strategic rather than necessarily reflecting his philosophical disdain for violence and acceptance of adultery? Kind of.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what he was thinking. So it's just a way to kind of think through some of the things that were happening in that period. But I can say that not only did he not blame Boissieu, he was really working very hard to not talk about her adultery. You know, it's just like, it was just, he suspected they would have the trop grande liaison. Like, he suspected this relationship, but he barely mentions it. I mean, everything is about her violence. He goes on and on about his injury. It's like lines and lines of, I had an egg-shaped swelling, and I didn't even understand half of it. It was a strain, and it was bleeding. And and nobody else also. None of the witnesses blame Boissieu either. All the witnesses are focused on what she's doing and how she's trying to get time. Her husband's traveling for weeks at a time, and she has her lover over, and then she goes with him to his chateau and convinces her husband not to come. That's what the witnesses are saying. But he's just, it's like, if you read only his statement, you would barely know that there was adultery in play. As for strategy, I mean, I think that, he could have very easily said, my wife's an adulterer, to scare her and then not proceed it. You know what I mean? So, it's harder to prove that. Whereas he walks in with his injury, and the Sirbo sends the Châtelet surgeon to examine him, and the surgeon writes up this report about how badly injured he is, even a few days later. So it seems like that would be a little bit harder to move back from. So I mean, again, it's all sort of speculation. It's just a way to think about, why when the norm is to do A, he's not. And maybe he's just really mad he got smacked in the head with a water pitcher.
Well, I have one question for Julia Ausman. Did you find any other hints at how if or in other cases where women served as soldiers? Because I think I remember that I once read something by two Dutch scholars on this cross-dressing issue and I think they said, if I not totally, it's a long time ago, so I think I remember they said that it was not terribly uncommon that actually there were women in the armies fighting as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that in my reading thus far, and this is a new project, so that's my big disclaimer. In my reading so far, it depends on who you're reading. So John Lynn, for example, who is one of the most prolific and important historians of the French army, wrote a whole book on gender and women in armies and said that you almost never find women cross-dressing and being soldiers, and when they do, it's really not that important. And I clearly disagree with him because Baudier, the same author that I spent so much time with in this paper, he also said in his memoir, as he's talking about it, he said, of course, it's hardly surprising to find a woman serving in a man's role in the army. It says, especially among the Germans. He said, but the German soldiers, their wives go with them everywhere, and they put on their husband's clothes all the time and get on horses and fight people. So half the soldiers you're fighting are women. So he really shouldn't be that surprised. So he actually says this in the memoir as well. And so I think that's that's kind of up to which sources you're reading, which historians you're following. And I'm glad you mentioned these two Dutch scholars, because I'm going to make a note of this now as well. And Julie can. Oh yes, yeah. And then I'll just add as well that too, you find also a lot of women participating in sieges in the 17th century as well. And then also because in the 17th century you also have, and earlier you have the army and the civilians, inhabitants interacting so frequently that yes, women are going to be involved in military violence as well. So.
But when somebody says that it's a German women, then that sounds also a little bit like Tacitus, so it topples that.
Yeah.
I also have a question for you, Julia.
Yes.
And I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but I am really interested in the point that was brought up in the comment about how normally this inversion of gender stereotypes is seen as very subversive, and especially the fact that this woman was the captain, so she was in a authority role, and also that they seem to know, like her soldiers had found out that she was a woman before this revelation on the battlefield. Is that correct?
They
Or
hadn't.
did they find out once they found her body, then everybody realized?
Yeah, once they found her body, and they were so surprised. They just thought they had this eunuch captain who was very valorous and fought great duels, and had been a castrato in a former life, and so there you have it. So they were very surprised by it. But it's interesting that you bring up, how this was very subversive, and yet they didn't seem particularly upset or sad or disdainful of her when they discovered her sex. But it's interesting because, and I'm also a little bit new to the 17th century. I was in a former life, I was an 18th centuryist, and in those cases, especially in the late 18th century, in the beginning of the French Revolution, when women were found to have cross-dressed as male soldiers, even though this was not allowed and this was not okay, they were usually given a pension and just told to go back to normal life. They weren't scolded or imprisoned or anything like that. In fact, to a degree, they were admired for their service, but they weren't really supposed to do it again. And this is also something that I'm wondering if that has something to do with the way that women often symbolize war or military violence or victory. And you think of, and this is much later period, but if you think of the frieze on the Arc de Triomphe, you have victory leading the people. And at first I thought it was this really awesome guy with a dragon on his hat. He's got a little revolutionary hat with a dragon on it. It's awesome. Going roar, and he's leading all of his men into battle, roar. And so I took a picture of it with my camera. And when I was blowing this up later to make it my Facebook picture, I realized that, this man is in fact a woman. She clearly has breasts underneath her breastplate. And so, often these women are also used as symbols of war. And I wonder if there's something dialoguing there. Again, new project.
Is it normal for there to be eunuchs in the army and as army captains? Because they also seem pretty okay with that. They're like, oh, he's just a eunuch. This is fine.
It takes all kinds.
Yeah. Just wondering, because that's also a very interesting sort of gender neutral category.
Yep.
This is less a question than a comment for the whole panel, but I'm struck between the difference between Julia's eunuch/Amazon, not a eunuch, but who is admired for being violent in a masculine sanctioned way against an enemy, and that's socially acceptable, versus these other women who are hurting their communities and they're hurting their families and they're deeply upsetting to everybody around them, and that's not okay. So it's like violence has different meanings. I mean, this may be a really obvious point. Violence has different meanings depending on the social context, but it seems to be far more so for women, perhaps, than for men.
The Dutch authors, it's Lottie van der Pol.
It's Dekker and van der
Dekker
Pol,
and
the
van der Pol.
transvestite in early modern Europe.
Which is the only thing. So I think that they sort of show that you have these discourses that diffuse the threat of female violence on the battlefield because they're patriotic, they're following their lovers, and all these things. So it's not really it's like it undoes the danger. So it's not. Whereas in our situations, it's a problem, right? They're acting problematically. They're reversing gender order. They're not following the constructs of femininity, and they're hurting people that are not enemies. So I think that it is really interesting.
Except just to, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add on that point too, because in reading Baudier's account, you could also say that this German cavalry captain is very maternal. She's sharing her plunder with her soldiers. She takes very good care of them. In things like that, you can really read the feminine into her actions, even as she is commanding men in battle and fighting.
And what this made me think of, and this also addresses Julius's welcome comment that, of course, the fact that Morissette Nail wasn't in the sources anymore doesn't mean everything went back to fine. But there is another striking difference in what happens when they're caught at first, because remember, both women were fugitives. So when Morissette is first caught, her initial interrogation, she has this completely different, there are so many witnesses who saw the fight, and her version is this alien, and of course exonerates her completely. It wasn't her fault. Louis Martin's dog was biting her, and that's how it started. And then just a week later, her second interrogation, this time in the Tournelle, where she's being really confronted with the fact that she will be killed, she's completely quiet and humble. She says, oh yes. Her answer to every question is, well, it could be that I picked up the rock, and it could be that I threw it, and I guess, to my great regret, it did hit Marie. So she's completely, I think, she's domesticated again in a way. She's quieted. Whereas Perrine Deschamps, she's swinging with all she's got, even to the last day practically. And I think that that's part of it too, is that it may be that Morissette had been humbled and put back in a place where she could live for 50 more years, really, without coming back to anybody's attention, whereas Perrine wouldn't do that.
Thank you very much for all 4 of these papers and a great comment as well. I was very impressed by the way each of you took very specific stories about women in different situations and used those to show what I take to be the dominant theme, that what got all women in trouble was transgressing a set of norms about sexual difference. And in one case, a woman serving as a soldier. In other cases, women using violence, which is a male activity, or even adultery, although that seems to create less anxiety than other things. So what is really interesting to me is how, in each case, the specific story reveals the very big pattern of anxiety about sexual difference and the transgression of those differences. So, is this the most important difference or transgression that people can make in this society? Or do these transgressions exemplify other kinds of transgression? In other words, is there something specific about gender that makes transgression more threatening than, say, I don't know, a peasant killing a lord, or a male peasant killing a male lord? So I guess I'm pushing, Julia, I'm picking up on your challenge about gender.
Yeah.
Is the difference and transgression of gender differences, and especially provocative or dangerous social act, or is this telling us something about how all levels of society feared transgressions of different kinds?
Okay. You're all looking at me? I'm looking at you.
You're
I'll do
looking
it.
at me.
Okay.
I was just going to say, I'll go ahead and get started. I don't have much to say, which is that in the Army, it seems to be okay. When just thinking of peasant killing a lord, if a soldier kills his officer, that's a much graver crime than to find out that your captain had been a woman all along, but a woman who had been doing a really good job. And I think it's. I also think in my particular case with Baudier, it's easier to deal with because she's already dead. you don't really have to deal with her. She's dead. So you can immediately construct a memory for her. You can immediately construct a narrative for her where, yes, it's possible that she did a really good job and she was very good for her men. However, she was still always a woman. She had that feminine weakness, and I found it. I found where that feminine weakness was. And now we can admire her beauty. And for me, this analysis is all about the contrast between the incredible beauty that Baudier defines in her dead body and all of the other carnage around her. And I think this really tells you something about Baudier, which is the kind of analysis I'm very comfortable doing. But as far as like her transgression and transgressing those gender lines, you know, they can make that okay to a degree. I have a feeling it's different for y'all.
Well, I think that in a lot of ways, and I'd say gender versus sex, that gender disruption is considered like the archetypal disruption. So like it's used as a way to think about what's the worst possible thing. And I think that one of the things that neutralizes, you can have women in positions like this, but it's okay as long as they're not gendered incorrectly, right?
Yeah.
So she's beautiful, she's maternal.
Right.
So it's a problem when the sex and gender aren't lining up. So there's a physical a woman who's sexed female who's not acting that way, and that's sort of the disorder. And at least in my studies, and it does seem like this is sort of the ways in which disorder is conceptualized. But Claire was saying earlier that, you know, back in everyone was like, what's more important, class or gender? So it may just be that things I'm reading, because I'm a women's historian, are about this. So I wouldn't preclude other things. But it's the question of when somebody's acting so incorrectly and there's no way to neutralize it. That's chaos. And so I think that gender disorder is considered chaos in a way that a peasant killing a lord is understandable and controllable, and there's this entire judiciary mechanism to deal with it, and there's discourses to explain it. But when women don't act like women and they act like men, that's scary. So I would say yes, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, and I want to push Nancy.
Mm-hmm.
Would the crime be even worse if the woman had killed a man than another woman?
I would say absolutely, because I think both of my cases, and when I look at them in this light, I don't see either one of them as a gender transgression. Mm-hmm. For one, Julius Ruff's work has shown us that pardons were almost routinely issued for what we would now call manslaughter, right? So when Morissette Nail picks up a rock and throws it in the middle of a fight, most people wouldn't have seen that as unintentional murder. And Perrine Deschamps beating up her husband's girlfriend, I mean, that would have been perfectly expected, I think, in a community in this era. So I don't think these particular two women have transgressed any gender norms. It just so happened that both of their victims died.
That seems to be clear that women's use of violence didn't transgress any norms except in very precise circumstances that crossed the line, attacking a woman who was visibly pregnant, who was visibly more wealthy, or if the husband was deeply involved, as in the case of La Musinière, her victim, the husband of the victim was involved, and he got caught into it. All other kinds of violence by women just seem to be normal, unproblematic. So it's not transgressing any boundaries there.
Unless there's another question.
It's not transgressing any boundaries? Okay, well, but women aren't supposed to be violent, are they?
Well, actually, that's the question. Here, I'm just like walking and talking. I guess, in a way, Nancy and Jacob answered what I was going to push for after Lloyd's question, because it seems pretty clear that women being violent is not particularly... I mean, there are circumstances in which women's violence is normal, understandable, and in fact, like a good thing. For example, if a woman were to fight to protect her child who's being taken away by or abused, abducted, that would be okay. And in the to go back to guilds, when the tailor's wife attacks the guild officers, she has some leeway, right? We know this from bread riots and things. There are times when women's violence is sanctioned by the community, when it's expected and normal, and when they may get in trouble with the authorities, but maybe less trouble than they would get in if a man did that. So not only is there endemic violence, there's maybe particular kinds of violence that women do. And so the question I kind of wanted to ask is violence in a way is it the right category for you? Does it link you four together in a way that's kind of misleading, in that it's not violence which is the problem? These are exceptional cases where the violence enters the record and then we have to deal with it. So is what we're learning from you something about community and community standards and community judgments and the way communities enforce their rules, and violence just happens to be the trigger that creates the documentation for it? Is that going too far? Just a question.
Violence is quotidian
Yeah.
in society. I mean, it goes on every day. And, you know, as I tried to indicate in my comment, I mean, you'll have litanies of past offenses, and then
Exactly.
finally one day, after 20 years, you know, the guy hits the other guy too hard and kills him. And then you've got a body, and it can't be swept under the rug. And, but it's a daily thing in this society.
No, I mean, this is why I've kind of latched onto this story, because my introduction kind of tells my journey, so to speak, to focus on this, which is that I'm looking for, anything I can get my hands on 17th century warfare. I'm trying to understand better how low-ranking officers and soldiers understood their role in this horrible violence that they're perpetuating all the time in the 17th century. That is, shocking to me. That would be shocking to someone fighting during the mid-18th century, maybe. And it's all fairly dry. Like, they're not pouring their hearts out the way I want them to. I want to put them on the couch and say, "How did you feel when you pierced him through with your saber? How did you feel?" And they're not telling me that until, of course, they come across this body of a woman, and then that kind of unlocks the emotions that Baudier hasn't been. I mean, he likes to go in. It's almost like a comic book. He likes to go in these great descriptions about all this blood and gore and guts and brutality and cruelty, but he doesn't offer any of his reflection on it until he finds this body of a woman, and that seems to provide for him the space. Like, that's an acceptable space for him as a man and as an officer to express what I've been looking for all along. So I hope I find more. Well, I hope I find more women on the battlefield, if only to tell me kind of what your more quotidian officer is thinking about.
Yeah, I think you're very right that it's showing some of the limits, particularly around pregnant women and husbands not attacking a wife in the presence of her husband. That you can attack a wife or a woman who's married, that's not a problem. But if the husband's present, that's a problem for him. And so you're very right that violence isn't the issue in the court records. It's more what is considered intolerable. And here, unlike perhaps community cases, these are individuals who bring the complaint. It's not a community who then goes to the police commissioner. This is the victim's husband, technically the victim herself going to render a complaint, but her husband, he is listed, he has to be formally the demandeur. A woman can't make a complaint who's married herself in Paris at this particular time for violence, unless her husband's away at war, and there's one or two other exceptions. So you're right, there's other issues going on in terms of their sort of masculine control, power, inability to maintain order. But if he isn't there, he's not going to cross it. You don't really see, with one or two exceptions, a husband paying for a court case, giving authorization to a court case where his wife has been attacked.
I might add one more thing. We talked about how lethal the violence can be. But in Jacob's case, and at least one of the other papers, someone was assaulted, and Jacob's woman lasted 15 days before she died?
No,
I'm sorry.
I have no
Okay.
murders.
Okay.
No. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. In your case, the victim lasted for almost 2 weeks. All of which indicates if she'd gotten to an emergency room in 21st century America, she probably would have been out of the hospital the next day. It's probably a case of an untreated wound in which sepsis sets in, and given 17th or 18th century medicine, she died. It looks a lot more lethal than it would be today, I think, in terms of, people often look at the early modern period and say, my heavens, how brutal, how violent it was. Look at the death rate. Well, if they had 21st century medicine, it wouldn't be like that.
So are you asking if female violence is sort of a false category? Because your question sort of made me think, okay, well, are we taking this later notion of middle class female femininity, and then we're saying, if we start with this as our assumption, implicit or explicit, women aren't supposed to be violent, therefore look at all these violent women, oh my God. But I'm wondering is whether in fact that it is a category because it had rules, right? So that women were supposed to be violent in certain ways and not in other ways, and that it was conceived of, there's certain sort of sets of ideas around that. There's sort of legal limits, communal limits, and sort of discursive limits. So I mean, I think your question is really great because I think it shows the ways in which it is a category, just not probably the ways we thought about it when we put the panel together.
And I'll just jump in because
Yeah.
you were just reminding me of something I've been meaning to say for like the past 25 minutes, which is that it's really interesting we're having this conversation now when women in violence is very much the center of a lot of conversations right now in the United States as women are entering combat in the infantry for the first time across all services. And military services in the United States have been gradually allowing women to take on more and more and more roles. And now it's been issued that women need to be involved, that you have to allow them to be involved in combat, which is creating, I don't know if anyone here is following this, but which is creating huge controversies and conversations about women and violence and what women can do and what women can't do. And some of these conversations are like, well, can a woman carry an 80-pound pack for 16 miles? And keep up, which is, kind of a legitimate question. And then there are other kinds of conversations like women can't participate in combat because lady parts, blah, which is less productive. But I mean, I think this is an interesting question about women in violence because we're having this conversation right here and right now in a contemporary context where we're trying to figure out what's okay, what's not, what's exceptional, what can women do, what can't women do, and where are the parameters of our society now, since this is one of the final frontiers that's currently being breached. Yeah.
Yeah. Free cars for everyone.
Look under your seats.
Thanks to the panel. I think this is great. It's a lot of fun. And that's just a really great point because I don't know if anybody belongs to MedFem. MedFem is the online discussion group for medieval women who study medieval feminist studies. And they've been bringing up a really interesting point now, which is in discussions of Hillary Clinton and the presidential election, there's been a lot of behind-the-scenes discussions about whether women are inherently more peaceful or more violent. And in the popular press, there's been discussions of early modern and medieval queens. And they've been trying to say, well, under queens, there's less war, or there's more war, or whatever. I don't even know what argument they're trying to make in the popular press. And therefore, women are inherently whatever, right? So the modern political process is actually trying to use what we do to make arguments about modern politics, which I think is just fascinating. And there's been a really interesting discussion about it. Katie Sherson, I forget where she is, but she actually wrote an article for Slate about medieval queens. So it's trying to address this. So I don't know if you guys read the online newspapers either, but I think it's a really interesting example of when our rather esoteric discussions of things like female violence can become very important in discussions going on today.
We're actually relevant right now.
I know, who would ever imagine?
Bottom line seems to be that if women can fight in war, if women are using violence, then a woman can be commander-in-chief and can be president. For me, this is no big deal. I grew up under Margaret Thatcher. We had the Falklands War and everything, but in this country, that may be more of an issue.
But I mean, the interesting thing is the discussion is women are inherently less sort of violent or warlike and therefore will be more pacifist in terms of running a government, perhaps, or because women are inherently weak, then other governments will be inherently aggressive, and then in a time of a woman ruler, there'll be more war, like the Falklands or whatever. See, there you go, women are whatever. And so I think it's just really interesting, though, the way that's tying into the argument.
I had
Just two things. One, that seems highly problematic because it's essentializing women in exactly the way that I think all historians are trying not to, oh, they're this or they're that. But secondly, the other question, are there any rituals of violence among early modern women? You know, like among men, there were rituals of dueling, or there were ways of organizing violence because it was assumed to be part of noble behavior, for example. Is there any ritual of violence between women? Have you ever seen that happen?
That's right. Yeah, the décoiffing, mutual décoiffing comes up almost all the time.
There you go, the coif. Okay.
Among, especially among market women, I've seen, women in the marketplace, they've been competing for long enough that, almost on a weekly basis, they're at it again, and yeah, the coif comes off.
No, Beaumet décoiffed his wife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the ripping of clothing in general, and the calling, the insulting,
Yes.
the whole range of insults. Laura Gowing has a book on that. If there are no further questions, I guess we are out of time. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a very lively session.